So now that we've actually added properties to a class and have gotten something to move, let's talk about adding artwork into our game and working with sprites in Unity. Before we do that, let's create a new scene. If we go to File, New Scene here, you'll see that the scene is untitled. I always like to work in new scenes. This way I have a clear place for me to work, test things out, experiment, before I actually put it into the real game. So let's save our file real quick here, put it into scenes, and we're going to call this Sprite Staging. And we'll hit Save. And also you'll notice that Sprite Staging is loaded up here at the top. Now if we go into the Finder and we drag the artwork into our Assets folder, Unity will begin to process all the artwork for us. Once this is done, if we look at our Assets folder, we now have Artwork, Scenes, and Script folders. We can go into Artwork, and let's take a look at our sprites. In here are all of the sprites that make up our game, and I've gone through and separated out each one. Whenever you load a sprite in, you'll see that there are two parts to it. You can always uncheck it. This is the texture itself, and this is the actual reference to it. Now, if we select the texture, you'll see up here that the texture type is set to sprite. If by any chance you don't see that this texture was automatically set to sprite, you may have inadvertently set your project to be 3D instead of 2D, and Unity will automatically turn these into textures. Make sure that you're in the 2D mode so that you don't have to manually go through and change everything back to sprite. Let's drag one of these sprites to the scene. Now, as you can see, this has now created a game object for us based on that sprite. And as we zoom in, you'll see that our sprite sits on top of a grid. Let's click on the texture. The next property that I want to talk about is pixels to units. So if we move this guy into this square like this, you'll see that he's actually 80 pixels by 80 pixels. And this square, which represents 1 meter in the game world, is actually 100 pixels wide by 100 pixels tall. So when we look at our texture and we see pixels to units, we see that the scale is set correctly. If we were to change this to 80 and hit Apply, our player would grow in size and would now fill this space, meaning that 80 pixels is the equivalent of 1 unit inside of the game world. Since we always want to keep our units correct, we're going to change this back to 100 pixels. Next, we'll talk about the pivot. Here, we can change the pivot point of any sprite through the drop-down menu. If we were to change this to top left and click Apply, just to keep in mind, if you forget to hit Apply down here and you try to move off of this panel, Unity will kindly remind you to hit the Apply button. So now you'll see that the sprite has actually moved down because its new center point is right here. If we were to rotate this, you'll see that we're set to rotate within the center. That's because we're rotating along the center axis. If we were to change this to the pivot point, you'll see that we're now aligned to the top left corner, and as we rotate the sprite, it rotates accordingly. If we undo that, go back into our texture, and set it back to center and hit Apply, you'll see that the sprite moves back into position, and now, if we rotate it, it's rotating along the center point. We'll undo this and set his rotation back. Next, in the texture, let's talk about the filter mode. By default, it's set to bilinear. We want to set this to point. And as soon as we set it to point, you'll see that all the pixel art starts clearing up. Now, this is important to keep in mind when you're doing pixel art. This game is going to be heavy in pixel art, so we want all the pixels to look accurate. If we hit Apply, we now have very crisp looking pixel art. But as we zoom in, you'll start to see that there's some strange artifacts. And that's because our format for the texture itself is set to compress. If we change this to true color and hit Apply, you'll see that all the pixel art is now corrected. So here, we need to keep track of the fact that anytime that we bring pixel art in, we always want to make sure that the filter mode is set to point and that the format itself is set to true color. We're going to want to do this for every sprite that we've imported. but it's probably going to be very difficult to find all the sprites inside of our assets folder. We can use the filter button here to filter through all of our textures. And here we'll select all of the textures that make up our game, and we're going to change the filter mode to point, and we're going to change the format to true color and hit apply. Unity will again go through and reprocess all the artwork, and now we'll have very crisp looking pixel art that isn't compressed in our game.